Okay, are we set? I believe at the end of the class last week, I gave some of you parts to act out Isaiah chapter 59. You're ready. Good. All right, so let's open up to chapter 58. What we're going to look at today, and we're going to look at it in some detail and relate to one of the questions that we did in the introduction, but it's also a couple of classes ago, but it's also inherent to the issues. They'll settle down eventually.
What page are we on?
What page? Chapter 58 in Isaiah.
Right, find it. It's the same in every book.
Yeah.
Same in every book.
Thank you.
All right, so. They're really noisy. Yeah. Wow, what a tough crowd. Okay. Everyone take a deep breath. Okay, good. Yeah, right. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Right. The fact that you feel you have to ask me is great. So what we're going to do is look at the end of the Haftarah for Yom Kippur. So we're going to where we left off last week. So we'll look at that in some detail, as well as we'll see, and I just prepared a few texts as examples of it, to see one of the questions we actually asked during the introduction was, what is the relationship of the text from the prophets in terms of how they play out within an understanding of halakha, of Jewish law, and how the tradition understood that. So we're going to use what we have in this week's class, and chapter 58 as an example of that. We'll see some rabbinic sources associated with it as well. All right, that sound okay?
Yep.
All right, good.
Anybody need one of these? There's an extra one here.
Yes.
Oh.
Oh, did you find it? I don't know. That's here.
No, at least I'm not teaching. I don't know, maybe you have a class. Okay, what page was it?
We're not telling.
Yeah, all right, I got it.
980, Rabbi.
All right, so just to summarize the context, we just very briefly, the summary we did last week. We looked at the beginning of the Haftarah, which begins Isaiah chapter 57:14, and suggested that chapter 57 and that latter part of the chapter was similar to, we also saw some parallels in the text themselves, to this time in which this prophet, whom we don't really know much about, right? We don't have a biography on him, is prophesying to the Jews in Babylonia. All right, after the time Cyrus is conquered Babylonia, and it's a time in which there is a hope for redemption. Right, so we saw in chapter 40, I comforted my people, and we emphasized last week also about Ami, my nation. Right, this notion that the people are still God's people. Even in chapter 58, when there's going to be a prophecy of criticism of the people, how they're behaving, it's still Ami. It's still, God says, my people. Right, so there is that very much still that sense of relationship, not a severed sense, but a sense of real relationship, which is, obviously fundamental. And so chapter 57, those series of verses are probably occurring in Babylonia before the return to the land of Israel has begun. Those we know not everyone went, only a small group. And chapter 58 is probably 20 years later, 30 years later, with the beginning of the return to the land of Israel. So it's probably taking place within the land of Israel. Okay? And with this notion, yes, the prophecy is they will come back, right? God's going to be coming back to them. They're going to do tshuva, repent, and come back to God. But it doesn't mean they're behaving completely as the way they should behave. So not surprising, since the first part of chapter 58 has dealt with fast days, right? Particularly, we assume, certainly Yom Kippur, right, is the primary fast day. And the people, if you remember, said, we're doing it, why isn't everything fine? And the response, if you remember, the response was, well, yeah, you're fasting on one hand, but on the other hand, are you doing those things that are supposed to be done as well? So you're fasting for your own affliction, and you're fasting to be a utilitarian way to expect a response from God. Well, don't forget what else you're supposed to be doing. All right, you shouldn't be worrying about on your fast days your own desires, your own business, etc. You should be clothing the naked, etc., releasing the bond. Then God will say, Hineni, here I am, and then you have the sense of a relationship. So there seems to be here, there's an implicit or explicit, actually, criticism of the people who think that ritual and an observance of the ritual is going to be efficacious without understanding that it's also supposed to be leading you to something and to be doing certain things. It's not a criticism of fasting. It's a criticism of fasting without that other element and that awareness of what it should bring. Now we also possibly have an allusion here to Yom Kippur, some suggest, because Yom Kippur at least would be the day of when the Jubilee happened every 50 years. All right? That Jubilee day would be on Yom Kippur. So this notion of releasing slaves, which has also an association in the Jubilee year, perhaps, we don't have any proof of this, just some people make the suggestion, perhaps it's also the fact we're reading this on Yom Kippur in Isaiah 58, it's an allusion to that Jubilee year. Perhaps that's the case. Okay, is that a quick summary of what we did? I think. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Okay. Is it not familiar to some? So everyone's been here before, right? No, is this your first session?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Did you watch the tapes, the videos? No, that's okay too. Do you have books?
We have one.
Good, all right, good. So that's fine, because that's the quick summary, all right? I hope that's helpful. And then what we're gonna be doing today is pretty much self-contained. We'll refer back to some verses, but pretty much self-contained. Okay, any questions people have? Not yet. All right, good. Fine, so let's look, and we're gonna read this closely. Let's look at, we left off at, we left off at just 13. We're just really just going to be looking at a few verses, but we're going to look at it in detail. Okay. So let's start at verse 12. Okay, so we would have just read, if you do this fast properly, and you share your bread with the hungry, etc., then when you cry, God will say, here I am. And then, let's start from verse 11. Okay, someone read from verse 11.
Which chapter?
Let's do 58.
The Lord will guide.
Any chapter is good, but we're going to be focusing on 58. Yeah.
The Lord will guide you always. He will slake your thirst in parched places and give strength to your bones. You shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters do not fail.
Right, now why should the land of Israel be like a watered garden? Yeah, well, because also it's actually an interesting image a little bit. Because rain, it's a watered garden. I don't know if that's a rain image here or not. I mean, it is and it isn't. What's another possibility of a watered garden?
It's growing.
Yeah, it's growing, but it also could be irrigation. Now, generally, right, in the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, the difference between the land of Israel and Egypt is Egypt is watered by the foot, as it calls, meaning it's watered through irrigation, through the Nile overflowing its banks, while since the land of Israel gets the rain from above. And so that's the distinction, all right? And then it continues, so you better behave and you'll get rain. If you don't behave, you won't get rain. Here, I'm just not sure. It may be just like a watered garden from rainfall. It could be. But Ukiyotzei Mayim Shazume Love, like a spring whose waters do not fail, that's not so much rain, I think, as it is more internal to the ground. So it's an interesting use of that image. Okay, verse 12.
Men from your midst shall rebuild ancient ruins.
Right, the temple had been destroyed, so it could very well be referring to that. The question is, Karvot Olam, when it says ancient, is 50 years, 60 years rebuilding considered ancient or not? I understand the question. In other words, is it, that's unclear. I mean, some people also want to read this as not only referring to rebuilding the first temple, this is 60, 70 years later, but as referring to some sort of messianic prophecy of ultimate rebuilding, so then you could have more of a past thing. But either way, okay.
You shall restore foundations laid long ago, and you shall be called repairer of fallen walls, restorer of lanes for habitation.
All right, good. So you're going to be called repairer of fallen walls. Has anyone ever here been called that? All right, it's not a bad thing to be called. No, it's a nice thing to be called. Okay. But then the last few words I just want to look on. Mishovev nitivot lashevet. Restorer of lanes. Paths. Nitivot are like lanes or paths. Mishovev, restorer of lanes for habitation. Lashevet. All right, that's the Hebrew. Okay, you hear the Hebrew? All right, so if you look at the next verse, verse 13. Why don't you read verse 13 and 14, and then we'll go back to it in details.
If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath delight, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and do not go your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. I will set you astride the heights of the earth, and let you enjoy the heritage of your father Jacob, where the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Okay. All right? Now, so we're dealing here, you'll notice, I mean, one of the questions here is, why is he suddenly talking about Shabbat? Okay? So that's one of the questions which we'll look at. But first, I just want to point out to you, just a little technically, the end of verse 12 was Mishovev Nitivot Lashavet, which is restoring the lanes of habitation. Verse 13, Im Tashiv Mishabat Raglecha. All right, now do you hear Mishovev from verse 12? Tashiv from verse 13. Lashevet, all right, which is habitation, but Lashevet Shabbat in the verse. Okay, do you hear that? I mean, the Hebrew, the words are all, they share common roots. They may mean a little bit of different things in the context here, but they share common roots, and they have that language. In other words, it's flowing. The way this is constructed, the language is flowing from this one topic of freeing slaves, the proper fasting on Yom Kippur, looking after people, and now it's just sort of flowing linguistically into the Shabbat piece. Okay? And so that in Tashiv Me Shabbat Raglecha, as it points out, it's turn back your foot from. Okay? Tashiv is to turn back, to return. All right? But also to turn back. All right? But that sense of turning. And teshuvah, repentance is an act of turning. All right? But if Tashiv Me Shabbat Raglecha, if you turn back your foot from, now he translates, we refrain from trampling is the general translation, but literally means turn back your foot from. So you get this notion, what do you generally trample with? Your foot, all right? So it may literally mean your foot here, but it has that broader sense, okay? Tashit me Shabbat Raglacha. Now, how does the verse define trampling? It says it wants you to refrain from trampling the Sabbath, but how does this verse define what trampling the Sabbath would be?
Well, it follows.
Yeah, so what follows it?
Do what you want.
Pursuing your affairs. Yeah, doing what you want, pursuing your affairs on my holy day. Now, the Hebrew word for affair, it's not the affair you're thinking of. You know the old joke, right? Sadie and Sarah are sitting in a park bench in Miami, and Sadie says to Sarah, I'm going to tell you something, you have to promise me you'll tell nobody nothing. And so Sadie says, okay, and Sarah tells Sadie, I'm having an affair. And Sadie responds, so new, who's the caterer? All right. Okay. Fine. What did I get out? Oh yeah, Chapan Sapphire. Now, it can mean your desires, chafetz, that's what you want. All right, but in the context here, it really means business. Okay, in the context of the prophecy here, it means business. I mean, looking at, so it's your affairs, really it probably means primarily your business affairs. Now, this word is, if you look at the beginning of 58, all right, so look at verse 3. Okay, in verse 3, the people are asking God or complaining to God because they say, Lama Tsamnu, why when we fasted? Verse 3, Velo Ra'ita, that you didn't see us. And we did what we were supposed to do. So God, why aren't you paying attention to us? Ininu nafshenu velo teda. We starved our bodies, and that word ininu, to afflict, is what is described in the book of Leviticus. On Yom Kippur, you're supposed to be inu et nafshotechem. You're supposed to afflict your bodies, right? Which is associated with not eating and drinking, right? On Yom Kippur, there was no leather shoes, bathing, anointing, sex, and stuff like that. But the primary ones are, the most famous ones, that they were eating and drinking. So there's if the people are questioning God. Lama tsamnu v'lo. Why, when we fasted, you didn't pay attention? Ininu nafshenu v'lo teda. Right? It's this sort of synonymous, this parallelism. We afflicted ourselves, and you didn't pay attention to us. You didn't heed us. All right? So the answer is, Hein biyom somchem, because on your fast day, timsa'u chayfetz. Okay? Sort of, you were finding your object, but it really means you were seeing to your business, chayfetz. Okay? So that's just where it's used. It's used earlier, and it's also used in a couple of other places. It's also used a little bit earlier. Kirvat Elokim yechepsun. They are eager for the nearness of God. They desire, and also the verb from chafetz again, right? Desire, but it's the same word which is used. All right, just to point out that what you have here in the chapter, in the beginning of chapter 58, right? We fasted, and then the prophet is, speaking for God, saying, yeah, you fasted, but what were you worrying about? Your chayfetz, your business. All right? And so in the end of the chapter, we have a similar thing. All right? What are you doing on Shabbat? You're worrying about your business. All right? Now, okay, pursuing your affairs on my own day. Worrying about business on God's holy day. All right, now think. How was that? All right. Now, what do we normally associate with refraining from what? I know it's when you hear Shabbat and refraining from doing certain things on Shabbat, what comes to mind?
Work.
You know, how do you define work?
But that's doing anything, lifting, in other words, anything that
Well,
would...
lifting is actually okay. But
Is that okay? Or-
well, it is and it isn't. We'll see
Okay.
how it plays out. Now, I'm glad you brought that up. Because we're gonna
I'm
see how
thinking
that
of
plays
turning
out.
on the fire of the pot. I know they keep it on.
Good. So
Those
the
kinds of
classical
things.
ones, good. The classical ones are lighting a fire. I mean, traditionally, there's an association of 39 creative labors associated with the building of the Mishkan, of the portable sanctuary described in the Torah. Yes,
I always understood it as not to create something new and not to destroy something
for a purpose.
for a purpose.
For a purpose. That is true. The question is, how do you define that? You're right. I mean, that's why it's associated, though. That's why when the Mishnah, when already the rabbinic text lists the 39 milachot, and then they listed actually, interesting, they listed it in agricultural fashion. All right, they list, so the first 13 are things associated with planting and food. So Shabbat, you're not supposed to plow, water, seed, winnow, thresh. Anyone here ever thresh? All right, well, you're not supposed to do that on Shabbat according to the Mishnah.
Then I'm safe.
What?
Then I'm safe, but I don't do it on my
Right.
day either.
And those types of things leading to cooking. Then you have a series of other labors associated with clothing, right? Sewing and whatever else you do with clothing. Then you have a series of labors associated with actually the making of books. Which are hides and tanning and dealing with hides, but H-A-I-D, yes. But the association with that is what you think about. What comes from a hide is parchment and Torah, right? So it's really okay. The writing of Torah, the writing of that. And then you have ones associated with building, right? Building a house, building and stuff like that. So that's how they're described, the prohibited labors, although not so explicit in the Torah. Lighting a fire is explicit in the Torah, but that's how they're described in the Torah, with a sense of, don't do it. Violating the Shabbat in the Torah is considered to be a capital crime. So that's the association in the Torah. Okay, you want to say something? Yeah.
In modern, if you're Orthodox now, you're not, can you use your computer? Or is that considered work?
Oh, you can use your computer, but it's considered a violation of Shabbat. But very much preserving autonomy. Well, it's actually, no, the truth, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. The whole issue of modern technology is one that people are really are going to be, within the tradition, are going to be struggling with. Although I would argue it's not just an Orthodox question. I think there may be different views on how one views Jewish law as authoritative, as suggestive versus authoritative. But I think that's still going to be an issue for people. I mean, I think there is a real issue of, across the, wherever you find it, for those who take Shabbat seriously, all right, wherever you find yourself denominationally, the issue of what should be the role of technology in my life on Shabbat is a question that cuts across that. If you were taking Shabbat seriously, right, however you define that, but that's a question that cuts across it. So there is that sort of, the general question. When you get to the technical mechanics of it, then, yeah, it's a certain type of particular question. Because you can certainly ask, is typing on a screen writing? You know, when we talk about writing, right? You talk about writing letters. There are all these wonderful questions that come up. So then you have to figure it out, but that certainly relates to a whole sense of the way technology has overcome our lives and what it does for us. And sometimes we have control of it, sometimes we don't. Think how many times at night you're, this it could be a Tuesday, I don't care. Think how many times in certain places at night you're turning on lights or turning off lights just by walking in a door and walking out a door. You're not doing anything. Right? But there's sensors and there's this and there's that. So that raises all sorts of interesting questions. But I just want to point out, yeah, someone else wants to say something. Were there another hand?
Yeah, this is just being,
Well, you
oh,
first.
she can go.
Okay.
Just being in control.
She's from Evanston, so yeah.
Just being in control, I mean, which is really.
Right, the being in control piece. At what point do you assert control and when do you good? Do you say, well, maybe I'm not totally in control. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Oh, two things came to mind. Work. I think of modern day work and going to a job, not working and getting a salary, which not everybody can do.
Yeah.
Secondly, how do we apply all of these agricultural laws to modern day life?
Well, the truth is, right. Well, you're asking an urban question. See, so what you're asking is an interesting urban question, right? Anyone here have a garden? All right, well, those are applicable. Right, watering a garden, seeding a garden, putting a furrow, planting. Those are all certainly picking produce, right? It's active harvesting, cutting, tomatoes off the thing. Those are certainly the same things. That really has agriculture follows industrialization, at some level hasn't really changed. Then there may be technical, for those who view this, seriously, then there are technical things that play a role in the context of even one's own home, watering plants. I mean, all of that. I don't think the agricultural stuff necessarily has to be read symbolically. I think it's just very real. It's just that most of us aren't farmers. If we were farmers, there'd be much more. And we've had questions, but particularly as many places people get to have their own gardens and urban gardens, and some congregations of gardens, and all of that. These are real. Then if you're taking those as authoritative, then those are questions that certainly apply. Yeah.
Is talking on the phone and considered melacha work?
Well, that's one of the technological questions. The answer is for the traditional community, absolutely. Except there's certain ways for certain emergencies in Israel. Technologically, they've developed certain phones which work a little bit differently, but that's related to, having a society in which, right? The problem with Israel, I don't mean problem in a negative way, right? The problem in Israel is that there is generally not a culture of a non-Jewish population. Well, there's certainly non-Jews in Israel, but in terms of a non-Jewish population doing stuff for you. Right? So for example, and I'll spend 2 more minutes on this, but for example, right, for someone who wants to observe Shabbat in the traditional manner, right, how do you, there's a question, how to use electricity on Shabbat. Now the answer is, all right, I leave lights on at home, right? I plug a warming tray in, the oven is on a timer, etc., whatever it is. But, because I don't worry here that there are Jews running the electrical plants or managing the electricity on Shabbat, right? But if there was a Jew who was managing the electricity on Shabbat, then I'm not supposed to get benefit from a Jew who may very well be violating Shabbat. I'm not supposed to get direct benefit from that. And now that's, again, in this country it sounds ludicrous, right? When you get to Israel, it's not so ludicrous. And you have all those types of questions, running hospitals, running this, running that, all those things that we know are out there, even if they're the most traditional observant person, right? They know they're out there, and they know there's a hospital they can go to, and they don't have to worry about stuff. So that's where some of these questions, get more complicated, and that's where certain people are developing certain technologies in Israel through various issues of Jewish law. We won't get into now to be able to do certain things, but those are generally, only done in emergency situations. All right, and that relates to this. I mean, I just want to point out here, when the Torah itself talks about Shabbat, it says, don't do milacha, don't do any of these prohibited later. Whoever does it should be put to death, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's pretty serious. Don't light fires on Shabbat. What do you have here in Isaiah? Isaiah is talking about what here with Shabbat? What does he want people not to do? Business, yeah. It's I don't know if it's going. It's more business than work. In other words, don't start selling. Don't start buying and selling. There's some sort of commerce almost on Shabbat. All right. Now, commerce is much vaguer in terms of what's prohibited, what's not prohibited. In other words, when you go in the store and buy something. Okay, forget credit cards, man. Let's pretend people use something called money. Anyone here seen money? Okay. So I go in the store. I give $1 to you. You give me whatever you can buy for $1 today. All right. Remember when candy bars were a nickel? All right. So, what?
I remember when it was a penny.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, we're about to say but you remember that. Right, you can buy a piece of licorice, whatever, for a penny. Right, so but that's a transaction that takes place. Strictly speaking, that's not a violation of Shabbat. Right? In other words, I haven't done it. In other words, I've taken something out of my pocket and given it to you. You've given me a piece of licorice. You didn't make the piece of licorice for me just then. You had it. I gave you a coin. You gave me a piece of licorice. Right? That transaction is not. You get how that transaction is different than lighting a fire, right? You get that sense. So it's interesting what Isaiah here, this nameless second Isaiah here, is talking about on Shabbat. It's not so much a violation like building a fire on Shabbat, right? It's something which is somewhat less clear. But he's still saying, he's still being critical of it, right? He's still being critical of it. Now, yeah.
Is there also a suggestion you're not only doing it, but you're thinking about it?
That too. That too. We'll see that in another verse, actually. That more of association with it. Yeah. All right, 1 then 2.
In the case of where you talked about turning on the electricity, is there a Jew working at the plant? In the case of going into a store to buy things that perhaps sustain you, now you're causing the storekeeper to be involved in his commerce. That's his job, to sell things. So if you go in to buy something, it may be for pleasure or for sustenance, but now he's tending to his situation.
Yeah, but the question is, in doing that, the technical thing here is in doing that, you're just handing over a little bit of money. That's all you're doing.
But that's his job, to open up the store.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. The fact that one has, I'll put it this way. Okay, my job is as a rabbi, right? I sometimes work on Shabbat, right? Now, I obviously, you can say, well, technically I'm getting paid. You can play all the games you want, but with that. But when I'm functioning in that, when I'm actually doing an official rabbinic function or whatever, I'm not doing anything that violates Shabbat. I may be speaking, I may be teaching, but I'm not doing anything, I'm not lighting a fire. Right? I may be quote unquote working, but I'm not lighting a fire. So the issue becomes there, it's not the job per se, it's the specific acts of a certain type, independent of whether or not it's your profession, which are understood as the biblical prohibitions. All right? And I'm just trying to point out that Isaiah, the prophet here, is taking it to another step. Yeah, you can say I'm not really violating Shabbat. I haven't lit a fire, I haven't done this. But I've bought something or worried about my business with something. That too is that too has to be taken into consideration.
But in that case, you're performing a mitzvah because you're enhancing the Shabbat.
Doesn't matter if I'm performing a mitzvah or not. But I'm not violating it.
Unless you're lighting a fire.
Right. I mean, I'm glad if people appreciate it, but yeah. When I'm lighting, I may hopefully lighting a metaphorical fire. Yeah. Do you get that difference? Or it's important. It's an important distinction because I think to understand what he's doing here, that distinction is necessary. Yeah.
So what I believe out of this is I understand that there's the literal and there's the minutia that has been gathering around what the restrictions are. But what it says to me is that I need a vacation from worry and obligation and not only that, but what should I be doing? So I should be learning, I should be relating to people, I should be thinking about connecting, I should be thinking about the good stuff. To me, that's the bigger piece than what I shouldn't be doing. If some of the shouldn't be doing doesn't interfere. If I use my electric toothbrush, I'm brushing my teeth. If I have to do this, I'm working harder. And I have to think about, oh my God, I have to do this more.
Well, yeah, but then but I'm going to challenge you on that and say, but then you're defining work as you're defining it, which is fine. That's not necessarily the way the tradition defines it.
Okay, but again, focusing on what I should be doing.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, that's part of what. Well, let's see the parallel.
Okay.
What's the parallel to the first part of Isaiah, of chapter 58? What happened in the first part? What?
He said, if you do the ritual and not do the other things, it's meaningless.
If
If you
you
fast and not take care of charity and do what you're supposed to do, what's the point of fasting?
Good. So that's the first part, okay, of this chapter. And the second part is Shabbat now. It's really the same. He's not telling the people, he's not railing against the people here that you're destroying, violating Shabbat. All right, that's not. It's more nuanced than that. It's something which is less explicit. There isn't this. The people are saying in the first part, we explicitly followed what God has commanded us, right? So the prophet in the prophecy comment says, God's saying, yes, but you've only focused on explicitly following, but somewhat you missed the point, all right? You can't claim your fasting as an act of piety and just worrying about everything associated with yourself and not worrying about others, all right? So then maybe there will be a parallel to Shabbat here at the end. Shabbat is coming at the end and saying, you think you're doing Shabbat, right? But you're worrying about on Shabbat your own business, your own desires, all right? And so there's that. Now, the question of what one is, we'll see how that plays out in the next few verses, okay? But there's a parallel there, all right? And so it's not only the sense of fasting and ignoring of others, that's the first part of 58, okay? It's even within the ritual area itself of Shabbat, and you think you're doing Shabbat, but you're not really doing Shabbat, okay? You're not really doing Shabbat. It's more complicated than that. So you think you're not really violating Shabbat by worrying about some business stuff and everything. The prophet is coming and saying, no, that's not the way to do it. But he's not. But I just try to point. He's not railing here against the people saying you're violating Shabbat. If the Torah is mechalel the Shabbat. You violate the Shabbat, you should be punished with death. That's not what he's doing here. Right? It's not saying that here. It's a much more nuanced understanding of Shabbat here. You think you're keeping Shabbat, but It's much more than that. All right, even as you think you're observing or not doing what you're supposed to be not doing, you're still missing something here with Shabbat. But that parallels the fasting piece. Okay, it parallels the first part in in just 2 verses here. It's paralleling what came before in chapter 58 with the fasting piece. And there's a similar thing. Yeah.
So when I read this, I don't read it as literally, and I wouldn't call it nuanced. I would call it this is a deeper message to the people of if you want these good things, like the water. To me, it's the water's nurturing. I tend to look at it as a metaphor. So what is the benefit? People will see your light. You will be nurtured, and the way you get to that is by really observing Sabbath, and by really taking care of your kid. It's almost like if God promises to the people to do these things, you get these benefits.
It has some of that in there. Yeah, I mean, it still has some of that in there, for sure. Yeah, we'll see. We'll go through the verses. We'll see how some of that plays out. Is someone else? Yeah.
Isn't Shabbat considered by the Torah the holiest even more than Yom Kippur?
As we understand it, yeah.
Okay.
So you have this also playing itself out in the same, implied in the same chapter. All right, good. All right, so where are we up to? What verse?
Starting 59.
No, we didn't finish everything.
Yeah.
Well, you read it. We haven't understood it. Okay. So in Tashiv me Shabbat Radlecha, you refrain from trampling the Shabbat, right? Pursuing your own affairs. So what's the next part of the verse? Vikarata la Shabbat oneg. If you call the Sabbath oneg, right? Delight. Likdosh Hashem mechubad. That which is holy to God, or the Lord's holy day, as he translates it, that you call it, therefore, mechubad, honored. Okay? So you have here, if you call Shabbat oneg, and you call, and if you call Shabbat oneg, and the Lord's holy day mechubad, right? V'chibarito me'asot dirachecha. And if you honor it, and it me'asot, which means not doing your ways, okay, your regular ways, mimimso chefzecha v'daber davar, nor looking after your chayfetz, your business affairs, v'daber davar. Now he translates it as, nor strike bargains. The Hebrew, now he's translating it as in a business sense, okay? He's translating it as a business sense. So you won't worry about your own business affairs. You won't strike bargains. But v'daber davar in Hebrew literally means speaking, okay? Literally means speaking. Okay. So therefore, the question is, what does it mean if you call the Sabbath delight, and the Lord's day you call honored? All right? And you honor it by not going about your own ways, nor looking at your own. Thank you. Is that Scotch?
Yes.
Oh. Thank you. It's very weak. Thanks. Okay, nor look to your affairs nor strike bargains. Right, so what? Now, anyone familiar here with the term oneg Shabbat?
Oh, yeah.
All right, why is it called an oneg?
It's delightful.
Well, it's delightful. What's
We eat
delightful about it?
We eat delights of Shabbat.
What?
We eat the delights of
Good,
Shabbat.
so you eat the delights of Shabbat, okay? Now, I just want to show you this. Where do you get this notion of oneg Shabbat? Yeah, you get it from Isaiah 58. Now, in other words, of Shabbat. Now I'm talking about the term, right? You'll notice here it doesn't describe what to do to create Oneg Shabbat. Okay, it's not describing what to do to create Oneg Shabbat. But what it is saying this is how you should be ascribing Shabbat. All right? Now, whether or not, there are different commentaries that suggest what does it mean that you should call the Sabbath a delight? Does it mean that people will call it? In other words, if you do it properly, people will call it, or does it mean that you have to get up and announce to everyone, in a loud voice, Oneg Shabbat. Don't go about doing your business, but enjoy Shabbat. In other words, this is something that will emerge when people stop worrying about their business, etc., and celebrate Shabbat. It will emerge organically that people will call it Oneg Shabbat, because Shabbat will be called Oneg, a day of enjoyment. Or is the message here perhaps to the prophet or to someone to get up at this, and shout on the street corners Friday afternoon, remember, don't do any business. It's Shabbat and you should call it an Oneg, a delight. Okay, whether it emerges organically here as an exhortation, it can be read either way. Right? So it mentions both Oneg Shabbat, right? And it also mentions Likdosh Hashem Mechubad, right? That the day should be called honored. All right, so you have these two terms here. You have Oneg, and you have, right? Kivud or kavod. Of honor. And so you have these elements associated with Shabbat here. All right, now, Isaiah doesn't explicitly define them. Okay, he doesn't explicitly define them. But these are terms here that he's introducing that are not true biblically. Okay, they're not found in the, biblically, of course they're biblical, they're in Isaiah. They're not found in the Torah. Okay, I mean, kavod is found, but not associated with Shabbat. All right, you got that? All right, so let me just read you something. Well, I have some text we'll look at also, but just let me read you something. So why am I using my phone? Because on my phone I have a complete Maimonides. It is unbelievable.
It is.
It's just
Yeah.
unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
Okay. So he says this, so I'm just going to read you. I have other stuff, but I'll just read this to you, and you'll get it. Maimonides says as follows, and I'll translate, don't worry. Arba devarim nemru b'Shabbat, shnayim min Torah, shnayim min divrei sofer. There are four things, okay, really means four terms, that are said about Shabbat. Two are from the Torah, meaning the first 5 books, right? 2 are from the Torah, and 2, he uses the term divrei sofer, are sort of words of the scribes. It means it's a different sort of authority, but they have their place in Tanakh. And he says those 2 other things, v'hein mufurashin ayidei nevi'im, and they are explained by through the prophets. All right. Now, you can probably figure out which 2 terms do you think are explained from the prophets? No! Oneg v'kavod. Which 2 terms are from the Torah? You have in the 10 Commandments in Exodus, Zachor, remember, and Shamor, from when the 10 Commandments are repeated in the book of Deuteronomy, you have Shamor, all right, which is to guard or protect, all right, and you have Zachor. So Maimonides points out, he's building this on rabbinic literature. Maimonides points out that from the Torah you have 2 terms associated with Shabbat, Zachor and Shamor. And from the prophets, which we have here, where are they from? Right here in Isaiah, you have Oneg and Kavod. Okay? And that those are the terms associated with Shabbat. And what's the proof text? Okay? That he quotes for these ones from the prophets. Shene'amar, as it says, V'karata l'Shabbat oneg v'likdosh Hashem b'chobad. You shall call the Sabbath enjoyment and the holy day to God honored. All right, he's quoting our verse right from Isaiah. All right, so that's the proof text. Just one sec. Okay. So, all right, good. So let me just pass out a couple of texts on this, okay? You'll see how this plays out in some rabbinic texts. All right. Here, you can just pass it down. If I'm short, you'll just tell me. Yeah, so just take one, pass it down, please. Pass it down. I'm probably going to need it. Let me just get one. Okay, thank you. If you're short, the other row, there should be enough for everyone.
One more down here.
Yeah, there should be extra. Okay. Does everyone have? Okay, so I have two Talmudic passages and one. Good. I have two Talmudic passages, one from Maimonides also. So the first one is from Shabbat. It's actually Shabbat 119, the top one. It said 118, but it's actually 119. So it says as follows. The Reish Galuta asked Rav Hamnuna. This is taking place in Babylonia. So Reish Galuta is the head of the community in the diaspora. All right? Asked Rav Hamnuna, what is meant by the verse, the holy day of the Lord honorable? Okay, or as we read it as, we translated as, yeah. Right, the Lord's holy day honored. So yes, what does that verse mean? So it's actually interesting. One opinion is that it actually refers to the Day of Atonement. He replied, in which there is neither eating nor drinking, hence the Torah instructed and honor it with clean garments. Now, what's going on here with the verse, where you get that conclusion, okay? So just look at the verse inside your Bibles, okay? Verse 50, it's verse, let me get the right page, verse 13, okay? So you have in the verse, if you call the Sabbath delight, the Lord's holy day honored. Right? So you have two words, right? Delight, honor. Now, delight, as you associate with it, I said, what came to mind with Oneg Shabbat? Well, you said, good little food to eat, right? Schmoozing, etc. But good food to eat. That's actually the association we have with it, right? Pleasurable things on Shabbat. So that's the Oneg part. So what is the mechubad part? What is the stuff? How do you honor Shabbat? If you're enjoying it through good food, how do you honor Shabbat? So here, there is this interpretation. There is another Sabbath of Sabbath in which you don't have oneg because you don't eat. But you do have still something which is honored because you get dressed up nicely. Right? So that's Yom Kippur. Okay, that's just, it's one way of reading the verse. But actually, kavod, honor, and oneg were both associated with Shabbat. So, and we'll see how that plays out in the next text. But that's just one opinion. Okay, you got that? Mm-hmm. All right. So, Honor it, okay. And that Rav said, and thou shalt honor it, okay. Rav said, what does that mean? By starting it earlier, Shmuel maintained by postponing it. Now, what Rav and Shmuel are referring to here is, when do you eat dinner Friday night? Well, that's the question. In other words, how do you honor Shabbat? Do you honor Shabbat by eating dinner a little earlier than usual? Or do you honor Shabbat by eating dinner a little later than usual? Right? But think about it, right? You're going out to dinner. Okay, now we're not in Miami, right? We're not going to get the special enforcement, all right? For the old Seinfeld episode. All right? But it's one of the problems, well, I don't know if it's a problem in Chicago, right? But you go to Spain. Anyone here been to Spain? What time was dinner? 11 o'clock, right? You went out to dinner at 6, they'd look at you like you were crazy, right? There is a culture of eating later, all right? It's a sort of maybe a luxury sign, I don't know, all right? So sometimes you can honor something by doing it earlier, right? And sometimes honor it perhaps by, doing it a little bit later. Depends sort of culturally where you are, perhaps a little bit. In other words, in Spain, you should argue, how do you honor Shabbat? Because you start eating at 10, as opposed to 11. In other words, that would show Shabbat is different in Spain. Okay? Here, how would you honor Shabbat? You'll eat at 7 instead of 6. I mean, it sort of depends on a little bit of a cultural occasion. But say doing something a little bit differently. Now, just to point out with it, but what time you eat, you're not violating anything of Shabbat, whether you eat a little earlier or later, right? But it's how do you contribute, how do you create the character of the day? You're making it different, okay? That's what's understood that Isaiah is alluding to here, all right? That it's not your business, you're not worried about business, but it's somehow types of things that make it different, yeah.
But since you have to cook for Shabbat, you have to eat. You can't cook on Shabbat.
Fine, so you leave the food in the oven. Already cooked. It gets a little mushy, but it's okay. You learn how to do that. You learn how to cook certain things so that it's okay if it sits in the oven. Yeah, right. I mean, don't expect rare roast beef. You're right. It doesn't always work. But you manage with that. Yeah.
But honoring it is making it different, making it special. You're
Good.
not eating on your everyday dishes. You'll take out the china and make it special. That to me is honoring it.
That's part of it.
Moving it from the ordinary.
Exactly. That's what Rav and Shmuel are saying here. It's what time you eat. It's all part of that. Exactly. It's all part of that. The real question becomes is, how do you make it special if you don't have the fancy dishes? You only have one set of dishes. So you figure it out. In other words, the notion of making it, it's that notion of making it different. Okay, that's what he's pointing out here. All right?
So is it different or is it not following your usual ways?
It's different because it's not following your usual ways.
Okay, what I'm trying to get to is,
Yes.
so when you don't follow your usual ways, what change does that bring about to our experience, to our existence? It's a different experience.
Yeah, exactly. You're creating it as, right, exactly. It becomes not just dinner, it becomes Shabbat dinner. Right? That's what I'm saying. There's how do you take what you eat on Tuesday and make it, let's say you can eat the same food or whatever, but how do you make it different? Right? That's exactly the point. How do you make it different? These aren't literally things you have to follow. It's just really suggestions of saying how do we take the ordinary and turn it into something a little more extraordinary on Shabbat.
And all I'm trying to say is, if we do that, it makes us different, our experience.
Oh, I assume so. Yeah, exactly.
Change that causes it.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Okay? Here, just the rest of that short piece. The sons of Rav Papa bar Abba, the son of Abba, asked Rav Papa, we, for instance, who have meat and wine every day, how shall we make a change? In other words, the notion of Shabbat is you eat special food, right? And these guys are a little wealthier. They ate really well every day. So how do we make it different So the answer is, if you're accustomed to dine early, postpone. If you're accustomed to dine late, have it earlier. Okay, a similar notion. Some suggest you say about the midday meal, not Friday night dinner, I don't care. But that same notion, okay? It's that same notion that somehow making it different, okay? Creating some sense of different, right? That's how these verses in Isaiah become translated onto actually Shabbat, all right? In terms of Jewish tradition, right? That's how they're taking these ideas, which are oneg and kavod are explicit, right? Honoring and enjoyment doesn't really tell you how. That's how it begins to translate that process. Now you got that? All right, so look at the second text. This is also from the same page in the Talmud on Shabbat. If you honor it, what does it mean to honor it? Your Shabbat clothing should not be like your weekday clothing, right? So again, if you don't have a lot of clothes, it just means dressing a little bit differently. It's not just talking about, this isn't just talking about the middle class and upper middle class. Right? Even the poor, you don't have a lot of clothes, right? But you do something different, all right? That your clothes are different. There's also a tradition of bathing before Shabbat. Right? Those types of things that you would do before Shabbat to make Shabbat different. Right? And now we have the terms. Now it's going to look at the terms from verse 13. All right, go. And you honor it by not going your usual ways. Okay, and go not your ways. That the way you walk on Shabbat should not be the way you walk during the week. Okay, now, let's remember about it. In the context of Isaiah, he's really talking about business. That's what it seems to be. All right? But for the rabbinic interpretation of it, they're going to look at each thing and say each thing should be different on Shabbat. So walk differently on Shabbat. All right? Now, how do you walk differently on Shabbat?
If you're rushing during the week, you could take it easy.
Okay. Yeah, it could maybe slow down. I mean, right, there are things, there are notions like that. But even though there is the very notion of the consciousness of Shabbat, right? Your consciousness of Shabbat should be different, right? So if you're walking, you should know you're walking on Shabbat, right? If you're at camp, you take a Shabbos walk. Right? That's what the kids do at camp. And there's a special, I know at Camp Ramah, they probably have the equivalent that Olin sang, where they take the Shabbos walk. But the very notion of taking a Shabbos walk, well, you're walking differently than you did on Tuesday. No, but it's Shabbat. I'm taking a walk. It's that much more subjective, piece. Okay. Nor pursue your business. And then it points out, your business is forbidden, God's business is permitted. Okay, anyone here on the board of this congregation?
Yeah.
All right, you're actually technically allowed to talk about stuff related to the congregation on Shabbat. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying you should have a meeting. You shouldn't have a meeting. But if you're talking about some stuff related to the congregation, okay, that's God's business. That's not your business. You shouldn't talk about your business on Shabbat. All right, but God's business is okay. So there's all sorts of examples of this. You want to fix a couple up together. All right, you can do that on Shabbat. Right? You can talk about who should we fix up so and so and so and so. That's okay. That's a little bit like God's business, okay? But you shouldn't really be talking about the stock market. All right? If you get the paper delivered on Shabbat, you shouldn't open up at the business section. That's the type of thing. Right? You get that, but it's that sort of sense. All right? And now, it's also, we saw about speaking, the diber davar, which this had as the translation striking bargains. Okay? Nor speaking, he says that your speech on Shabbat should not be like your speech during the week. Okay? Again, a sense of consciousness on how you're going to speak. Right? So I know people who don't use any verbs when they talk on Shabbat. That's a joke. I just made that up. But that sense, but somehow, just it's a matter of a certain type of consciousness. Okay, it's a matter of a certain type of consciousness. And that's how it's really, that's how the rabbinic tradition understood it. It's an area that goes, yes, some behaviors associated with it, good food, nice clothes, if you can, but it's much more than that. It's what the rabbinic tradition understood from Isaiah really was saying, having a sense of consciousness, that you're not going to do business, but you're going to try to actively behave differently on Shabbat, not because how you acted on Thursday is wrong, right? There's nothing wrong with doing business on Thursday. That's what you do to sustain yourself. That's great, but Shabbat somehow have a different sense of consciousness, okay? Imagine if you were to come into services Friday night with a consciousness, I'm going to speak a little differently on Shabbat. All right, this Shabbat. Now that's, you have to think about, well, what would that mean to speak differently? Not gossiping. You shouldn't gossip anyway, but I mean just, a type of language, inflection of language, not trying to be angry. I mean, there's lots of things one can think about, but it's just this, it's this sense of this consciousness, okay? It's building up a certain type of religious consciousness. In this case, specifically associated with Shabbat. All right, let me give you one more example of this. We have time? Yeah, we have time. And let me give you another example of this. And this is from Maimonides, also, the Laws of Shabbat, chapter 24. This is a technical thing, but anyway, we'll see it. So he says as follows. Maimonides says, the sages forbade manipulating some things on Shabbat in the manner that you would do so during the week. Now by this he means, by manipulating, he let's say means moving certain things. In other words, which isn't, in which you're not violating Shabbat in any way. All right, so I'll give you an example of this. All right, again, this is a traditional practice. That's the framework Maimonides is addressing. But I think there's important ideas with this. All right, so for example, at home, in my house, we have lights that we put on before Shabbat. We put them on, my wife is in charge of the timers, okay? So that they're on Friday night, they go out, midnight, whatever time Friday night, and then they'll come on later Saturday afternoon, so that there's light in the house. But it's all preset according to the timers, okay? You have these timers, every night, you probably do it on some fancy computers. We still use those timers. So we have a lamp. We have a regular, lamp you can pick up and move. All right, so Friday night, my wife moves it before Shabbat. She moves it from this corner over to here because it'll give more light for people who come over reading or something Friday night. All right? Now, what I can't do is, on Shabbat, according to this, is pick up that lamp and move it. All right? Now, if picking the lamp and move it, I'm not, in any sense of the tradition, violating Shabbat. I'm not turning it on or off. Okay, assuming electricity is like fired, I'm not turning it on or off. Right? I'm not doing anything like that. I'm in the house, I'm just moving it over, so it'll be better. Right? So that's what Maimonides here is, this type of thing is Maimonides is talking about. I can't manipulate something. I can't manipulate it, even though from a technical point of view, I'm not doing anything wrong. All right, you got that? All right, so let's continue. So why did they address this prohibition? Why did the sages, he's really saying, make up this prohibition? All right? So he says as follows, they reasoned. If the prophets admonished and commanded that the way you walk on Shabbat should not be like the way you walk during the week. All right? And the prophets here, he's saying is Isaiah. That's how he's understanding Isaiah. Right? So you're seeing the source. And that your conversations on Shabbat should not be like your conversations during the week. All right? As it is said, quoting our verse from Isaiah, nor speaking thereof. Again, in the contextual explanation seems to be striking bargains, but it's taken, each phrase is taken independently, nor speaking thereof. Then he says, if the prophets did that, then obviously the sages reason the way you manipulate things on Shabbat should not be the way you manipulate them during the week. Thus, Shabbat will not be like a weekday to him. And he gives examples now. Leading him to lift and repair vessels, moving them from one corner of the house or house to the house, bearing rocks and the like. Okay, those activities, you're not doing anything wrong. All right. So, for example, Shabbat, I shouldn't start. I have a lot of books, thank God. All right, I shouldn't start rearranging them on Shabbat, taking them out and putting them here. I'm not violating Shabbat. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's something. It's making it, Shabbat distinct. Since he is sitting idly at his house, he will look for something to occupy him. And it will turn out he did not rest, and he ignored the meaning given by Shabbat so that he may rest. Furthermore, some people are not professionals. They remain unemployed their whole lives, traveling and lounging around. Their whole lives are a break from work. If it would be permitted for them to walk, speak, and manipulate items as on a weekday, they would not have rested in a recognizable manner. Now again, but I just want to point out here, these are types of things that are not explicit Torah violations on Shabbat, right? But Maimonides based, how the tradition understood Isaiah here was saying that, yes, you have the specifics in the Torah, all right? But what's the character of the day? What's the character of Shabbat? It's got to be something more than that. So yes, don't violate the specifics, all right? But Shabbat has to be an oneg. Shabbat has to be mechubad, kavod. It has to be honored, all right? So how do you honor it? Okay, good food, you change clothes, you try to eat a little differently. But even to the point here, yes, don't think about business on Shabbat. And the sages took it one step further. Think about how you talk on Shabbat. Think about how you walk on Shabbat. Is there something about a consciousness that you can have that's going to permeate your day? All right? And Maimonides adds the pointer, even the rabbis, based on what Isaiah was doing, took it one step further to ensure that your consciousness of the day. So they said, don't start carrying around manipulating stuff that you have no real reason to do it on Shabbat. Okay? It's sort of a progression from the Torah strict applications, Shabbat, Isaiah taking it as they understood. What's the consciousness of the day? Don't do, even things that you may argue are technically permitted, don't do them, right? Because that's not going to create oneg or kavod for Shabbat. To here, taking it one step further, we're even perhaps going beyond Isaiah, but again suggesting that how do you create the consciousness of Shabbat, right? And they're suggesting that within the tradition that was understood to be at least one, an aspect of the message here of Isaiah. All right? And we just saw it also complements the fasting thing, right? You think you're playing by the rules of fasting? No, you're not playing by the rules of fasting because you've lacked the consciousness of what the implications of fasting should be. All right? And what you should also be worried about. You think you're doing Shabbat? Yeah, but you're also lacking potentially the consciousness of what Shabbat could be. Right? And they're both joined together. Both these areas are joined together in Isaiah 58. All right? Okay, yeah.
So is this the reason why I don't move my candle holders until Shabbat is over?
Yes.
I knew I'm not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
But I never knew the reason.
Yeah, that's where it's understood. Right. Right. Theoretically,
So
you're not
good
doing
to know the reason.
Yeah, theoretically, you're not doing anything. Right. Exactly. All right. Yeah. Is there any? Yeah.
Just personal reaction.
Yeah, please.
So it talks about doing things different in the sense of not doing it by rote or by hand, which increases consciousness.
Can't hear him.
You speak up, please.
It talks about not doing things by rote or by habit, which can increase consciousness. And in English, it's business, but you can also think of it as busyness. So
Good.
getting busy as opposed to forcing yourself not to get busy. So
Good.
it's not rest like sleep. It's
Right.
having time to be more aware, more conscious, more thought, whatever fills that time.
Good. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's a nice way, a good way of putting it. Because what I want to do is, I guess I don't want people, I guess my challenge to reflect about is, I want this to cross denominational lines. This isn't just, right, I want you to think about, no matter how you do Shabbat, but when you're doing Shabbat, all right, is there, this stuff applies, is there a certain consciousness, all right, that extends into it in the types of things you're doing? What does it mean to have people over Shabbat, but what does it mean to talk about at the table? All right? What does it mean to talk about with people at the Oneg? How does that play itself out? Yeah.
What if you bring somebody a shot at a meal?
Yeah.
You're walking to the person's house, but you're carrying something.
It's a mitzvah.
Yeah, it's a mitzvah.
So that would be okay?
Well, you're asking a technical question.
Yeah.
The technical question is, if it's an area in which you're allowed to carry in, it's fine. So if you're worried about getting food to someone who's a shut-in, you bring it over before Shabbat. I mean, that's the simple solution if it's going to be a problem. But look at my kids' neighborhood, where my daughter used to live in New York, in Washington Heights. It had an area people could carry in it. There was a whole table Friday night at the synagogue. A lot of them came Friday night, a big crowd, and they'd be eating at different people's homes. It was just among friends and stuff. This was a younger 20s and early 30s crowd. And so if you're going to someone's house for dinner, I'll make such and such for dinner. So, people, they're younger, they're working, so everyone essentially inviting someone for dinner means that they know the rules of the game. People knew the rules of the game. All right, I'll bring a kugel, so they don't have to cook a whole dinner. So I'll bring the kugel, someone will bring the dessert. If you're really good at it, you don't have to do anything. Right. I once was at this actually happened, it was very funny. A good friend of mine who I love, I told them, they invited me for dinner Friday night. I guess my wife was out of town that Friday night. So I said, fine, I'll come. And I do the cooking at home anyway, it wasn't the cooking issue. But I said, oh yeah, and I have some such and such and such and such that I can bring, that I was going to make. And I'll make it and bring it. Well, I thought I'd be bringing stuff in addition. There was some meat, some nice side dish. Turns out she didn't make anything. It was very funny. And there was an old Mary Tyler Moore show. Remember with Ed Asner and stuff? That old show? There was one show where Sue Ann made dinner at Mary's house. I don't know if you remember this episode. Sue Ann made dinner at Mary's house, and I know this is on the video, but deal with it. Sue Ann made dinner at Mary's house, and Ed Asner, Lou, was there, and he said, that looks good, and he ended up taking like 3 portions of it, and it was carefully designated how many there were, so she has to go by, Mr. Grant, you took 3 portions. Oh, I took too much, I'll put it back. So the same thing happened. I mean, I had this dish I had made, there was something there, wasn't it? And my friend's son took like, I said, no, that's too much. I'm very direct. I said, no, there won't be. So it reminded me of that. How was that? But they would, so Friday night at the shul, there'd be a big long, tables this long set up where people would put, so they wouldn't have to go home and schlep it. They'd, bring in the kugel, the cake, whatever, to the synagogue Friday night. Services last an hour, and then they'd go wherever they were eating. They'd just carry it with them. Because that was, everyone would do that. But that's part of that, that's part of that communal sense. Now, also, God willing, they're worrying about people who also, not just their friends, but, really didn't have food. That's exactly part of it. You can also make sure it gets in before or whatever. But that's what a community does, right? That's part of the community. The point is, if you're doing that for someone for a Friday night, make it a little extra special. Or, different special than it's Friday night. Yeah.
When I visit my relatives who are observant, we play Scrabble. Is that? How to playing games, and is that
But
leisure?
even playing games, right, but that's part of the point. Some board games or whatever, that's part of enjoyment of Shabbat. It doesn't have to be heady, super intellectual stuff, but it's saying, how many times do you just sit around doing that?
That's right. It
Right?
is different.
Friday
Yeah.
Friday night in my house, It still is, and certainly growing up with the kids also. They knew computers were off, et cetera, et cetera. So Friday night, we'd be sitting, 5 of us in the living room reading. And that was great, right? Just being able to sit and read, in that sense. I mean, so it's a subjective thing, but it's just trying to understand to get, there is an element here in which Isaiah is reminding us that the text is important, the practices are important, but the religious consciousness goes beyond that and has to ask, well, what's also the purpose of this? How do I expand upon it? That's, I think, that's part of, what he's playing out here, I think, in terms of this kind of stuff. And I think it complements well the beginning part, of Isaiah with that, and how it plays out. Okay. All right. Anything else?
May I say something that's not related to what we believe?
If it's relevant.
Well, on page 983, I kept reading Hebrew while you were talking. I was able to go. I'm a woman. Multitask, and it's very interesting because on page 983, the Hebrew, it says, "Ufa'ar Hamas b'kabechem." This is not the first time that Hamas is mentioned in the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
So I just wanted to
Verse,
bring it up.
which verse is that?
Second line.
Second line.
Second word in.
Ufa'ar Hamas b'kabechem. And there's also in the prayer V'ahavta, the conservative way, and if you're not going to listen to me, you will have Hamas be'artzachem, in your land. So I just wanted to bring this up.
No, that's...
Look at what's happening. Do you see the word
The
Hamas?
first use of it is in chapter 6 in the story of Noah, that the earth became corrupt before God, that Timaleya Aretz Hamas, the earth was filled with lawlessness. Right, here it's the Hebrew word. Hamas is violence and lawlessness. Yeah. All right.
Is that where the Arabs get it?
No, I don't think so. I don't know what the relationship between them is. No, but Hamas in Hebrew is violent. That's the problem with Noah, right? The earth becomes filled with violence. God says this was what creation was about. Okay, so I'm done for the 3 sessions. I know we just touched on a little bit of a section of just 2 chapters, 2.5 chapters from Isaiah, but just hope you get a little bit of a feel of some of the issues. And also the Haftarah for the Yom Kippur, I think we did well too. So, all right, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.